The sacred grove of the Serpent's Blood Pack gleamed silver under the full moon's radiance. Ancient stones arranged in perfect circles that had witnessed countless bonding ceremonies throughout the generations. Tonight, the air thrummed with anticipation and magic as unmated wolves gathered for the most important ritual of their kind, the pairing ceremony, where fated mates would be revealed and bound together for eternity. Eris Moonwhisper knelt among the other unmated wolves, his slender frame trembling with a mixture of excitement and terror. At 19, he was considered young for bonding, but his Omega nature had manifested early along with the rare healing abilities that marked him as special among his kind. His gift was extraordinary. He could mend not just physical wounds but emotional ones, drawing pain from others into himself and transforming it into something manageable. The ability had made him valuable to the pack, but it had also set him apart. Other wolves often found his gentle nature unsettling, his empathic sensitivity making them uncomfortable. They preferred their Omegas to be submissive but strong, nurturing but not overly emotional. Eris was all emotion, all compassion, all heart, and that made him vulnerable in ways that traditional pack structure didn't know how to protect. Across the ceremonial circle stood Kale ironclad, the pack's chosen leader-in-waiting and everything an alpha should be. Tall and powerfully built, with the kind of commanding presence that made other wolves instinctively submit, Kale embodied the strength and dominance that their people valued above all else. His dark hair gleamed in the moonlight, and his steel-gray eyes surveyed the gathering with the confidence of someone born to rule. Eris had harbored secret feelings for Kale for years, though he'd never dared express them. The future alpha was everything Eris admired: strong, decisive, protective of the pack. In his dreams, Eris imagined what it would be like to stand beside such a leader, to use his healing gifts in service of Kale's vision for their people's future. When the pack elder raised his ceremonial staff and called upon the moon goddess to reveal the bonds she had decreed, Eris felt his heart racing with desperate hope. One by one, silver threads of light began to appear, connecting destined pairs across the circle. The sight was breathtaking, a visual representation of love ordained by divine will. When the thread blazed to life between him and Kale, Eris felt a surge of joy so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. This was it, his destiny, his purpose, his future. Despite all his insecurities and the whispered doubts of others, the moon goddess herself had deemed him worthy of their future alpha. With trembling steps, Eris began to make his way across the circle, following the ancient protocol that would bring him to Kale's side. His legs felt weak, his hands shaking with nervous energy, but his heart soared with happiness. Finally, he would belong somewhere completely. Finally, he would have a place where his sensitivity was valued rather than tolerated. "I accept the bond the moon goddess has revealed," Eris whispered as he approached Kale, the traditional words feeling sacred on his lips. "I offer myself as your mate, your partner, your—" The words died in his throat as he saw Kale's expression. Instead of joy or even simple acceptance, the alpha's face was twisted with disgust and contempt. The silver thread connecting them pulsed with tension rather than harmony, and Eris could feel Kale's revulsion washing over him through their nascent bond. "You?" Kale's voice carried across the silent grove, filled with such disdain that several pack members gasped. "The moon goddess expects me to bind myself to an Omega who reeks of fear and weakness?" The words hit Eris like physical blows, but worse was yet to come. As the entire pack watched in shocked silence, Kale deliberately stepped forward and spat at Eris's feet, the gesture so deeply insulting that it sent ripples of disbelief through the gathering. "I will not bind myself to Omegas who smell of terror," Kale declared, his voice carrying the full weight of alpha authority. "You are weak, pathetic, and I am ashamed that fate would even suggest connecting us. Look at yourself, trembling like a leaf, ready to weep at the first sign of adversity. What kind of leader's mate would you make?" Laughter began to ripple through the crowd, cruel and cutting. Someone Eris never saw who threw a stone that struck his shoulder, drawing blood that stained his ceremonial robes. He looked around desperately for support, for someone to defend him, but found only turned backs and averted eyes. Even his own father looked away in shame, unwilling to meet his gaze. The pack elders, who should have intervened to protect the sacred nature of the ceremony, remained silent. The message was clear. Kale's rejection was not just personal but unanimous. The pack agreed that Eris was unworthy. I, Kale Ironclad, future leader of the Serpent's Blood Pack, reject this bond, Kale declared formally, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. I will not be tied to weakness, to shame, to the disgrace of an Omega who brings nothing but dishonor to our bloodline. With that, he reached out and grasped the silver thread connecting them. His face set in lines of cold determination. When he tore the bond apart, the agony that ripped through Eris was indescribable. It felt like having his soul split in half, leaving jagged wounds that he instinctively knew would never fully heal. Eris collapsed to his knees as pain overwhelmed him, physical and emotional trauma combining into something that threatened to destroy his sanity. Through his empathic abilities, he could feel the pack's emotions. Embarrassment, relief, cruel amusement, and underneath it all, a sense that perhaps this outcome was for the best. Remove him, Kale commanded coldly. This ceremony is sacred. I won't have it further contaminated by his presence. Strong hands hauled Eris to his feet, though his legs could barely support his weight. As they dragged him from the sacred grove, he heard the ceremony continuing behind him as if nothing had happened. Other bonds were being celebrated while his lay in shattered pieces, forgotten and discarded. They didn't even give him time to pack belongings or say goodbye to family. At the edge of pack territory, they stripped him of his pack token, the silver medallion that had marked him as a member of Serpent's Blood since birth, and thrust him into the wilderness with nothing but the torn ceremonial robes on his back. Don't come back, one of the guards said, not unkindly but with absolute finality. There's nothing for you here anymore. And so began Eris's exile into the Forgotten Lands, those wild territories beyond pack protection where rogues and outcasts struggled to survive. For 3 weeks, he wandered through increasingly desolate landscape, his body weakening as the rejection trauma took its toll. The severed mate bond had left him unable to shift properly. His connection to his wolf form fractured and unstable. Without his wolf's enhanced senses and strength, Eris was just a broken human stumbling through dangerous territory with no survival skills and diminishing hope. He survived on wild berries and stream water, sleeping in caves and abandoned ruins, always moving to stay ahead of the predators, both animal and supernatural, that hunted in these lawless regions. The worst part wasn't the hunger or cold or constant fear. It was the crushing loneliness, the knowledge that he was truly alone in the world for the first time in his life. His pack had been everything to him: family, community, identity, purpose. Without them, he felt like a ghost haunting his own existence. In the cities and towns he occasionally passed through, Eris discovered that a packless Omega was viewed with suspicion and disgust. Traders wouldn't sell to him, innkeepers turned him away, and more than once he was chased out by groups who considered his very presence a contamination. An Omega without pack protection was seen as either dangerous or diseased, possibly both. It was in one such town, weak from hunger and illness, that Eris finally collapsed. He had been trying to find work, anything that would buy him a meal and a safe place to sleep, when his strength finally gave out. As consciousness faded, he thought death might be a mercy. At least it would end the constant ache of the broken bond and the shame of his rejection. But death didn't come. Instead, he woke to find himself in clean clothes, lying on a soft bed in what appeared to be a carriage of extraordinary luxury. The interior was all dark wood and rich fabrics, with windows that showed landscape rushing past at impossible speed. Finally awake, are we? The voice was cultured and smooth, with an accent that spoke of education and refinement. Eris turned toward the sound and felt his breath catch in his throat at what he saw. The being seated across from him was devastatingly beautiful in the way only vampires could be. Pale skin that seemed to glow with its own inner light, dark hair that gleamed like polished obsidian, and features so perfectly sculpted they seemed almost artificial. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as otherworldly, deep crimson like garnets or fresh blood, ancient and knowing in a way that spoke of centuries of existence. I am Virian Nightfall, the vampire said, studying Eris with those penetrating eyes. And you, little wolf, were dying in the marketplace of Greenvale. The flesh traders were already sizing you up for their stock when I intervened. Flesh traders. Eris's voice came out as barely a whisper, hoarse from disuse and confusion. Slavers who specialize in supernatural beings. Virian explained matter-of-factly. A Packless Omega would have fetched a good price, especially one with your obvious breeding and unique qualities. Unique qualities? You're a healer, Virian said, as if it were obvious. I can sense the magic in you, even weakened as you are. That's quite valuable in certain circles. The implications of what Virian was saying slowly penetrated Eris's confused mind. Did you buy me from them? I purchased your freedom from them, Virian corrected with a slight smile that revealed the tips of elegant fangs. What happens next depends entirely on what you're willing to offer in exchange for that freedom. Eris closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his situation settling over him like a shroud. He had gone from pack member to exile to slave merchandise in the span of a month. The fall was so complete that he almost couldn't process it. What do you want from me? He asked, opening his eyes to meet Virian's gaze directly. Service, Virian replied simply. I have need of someone with healing abilities in my household. The work would not be onerous, tending to injuries among my staff, maintaining the health of those under my protection, perhaps occasionally assisting with more complex magical undertakings. And if I refuse, then I will set you down at the next town with enough coin to establish yourself independently, Virian said, his tone suggesting he meant it. I have no interest in unwilling servants. They're inefficient and troublesome. The offer was more generous than Eris had any right to expect, especially from a vampire. The old stories painted vampires as cruel masters who delighted in the suffering of those under their power. But Virian seemed different, cold perhaps, but not needlessly cruel. I accept, Eris said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. Excellent, Virian replied with satisfaction. We should reach my estate by evening. You'll have time to rest and recover your strength before beginning your duties. The estate that came into view as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson was unlike anything Eris had ever imagined. A massive manor house dominated the landscape, its architecture somehow managing to be both imposing and elegant. Gardens stretched in all directions, perfectly maintained despite the remote location, and he could see other buildings scattered across the grounds. Servant quarters, workshops, stables for horses that seemed too beautiful to be entirely natural. It's magnificent, Eris breathed, his first genuine expression of wonder since his rejection. It's home, Virian replied simply, but there was something in his tone that suggested the word meant more to him than mere description. Eris's quarters were in the main house, a suite of rooms that was larger and more luxurious than anything he'd ever had in the pack. A sitting room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the gardens, a bedroom with a bed soft enough to drown in, and a private bathroom with a tub large enough for someone much larger than himself. The staff will show you around tomorrow, Virian said as he prepared to leave Eris to settle in. For tonight, rest and recover your strength. Your duties can wait until you're properly healed. Thank you, Eris said, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything. For saving me, for this opportunity, for treating me like a person rather than property. Something flickered in Virian's ancient eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. Despite what your pack may have told you, he said quietly, you are a person. Your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. The words hit Eris harder than any blow could have. In all the weeks since his rejection, no one had suggested that he had inherent value beyond his usefulness. To hear it from a vampire, of all beings, was both unexpected and deeply moving. In the days that followed, Eris began to understand what his new life would entail. Virian's household was extensive and complex, populated by beings from various supernatural species who had found sanctuary under the vampire lord's protection. There were humans who had been cast out by their own kind for various reasons, shapeshifters who didn't fit into traditional pack structures, and even a few other vampires who seemed to be recovering from some form of trauma. His duties as a healer were exactly as Virian had described, tending to injuries and illnesses among the staff, maintaining their general health, and occasionally assisting with more complex magical work. The work was challenging but satisfying, giving him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his exile. But it was the unexpected aspects of his service that truly began to transform him. Virian proved to be an excellent teacher, sharing knowledge about magic and healing that went far beyond anything Eris had learned in the pack. Their evening conversations, which began as simple debriefings about the day's work, gradually expanded into discussions of philosophy, history, and the complex relationships between different supernatural species. "You have remarkable instincts," Virian observed one evening as they reviewed a particularly complex healing case. "Your techniques are intuitive rather than learned, which suggests your abilities are far stronger than even you realize." "The pack healers always said I was too emotional," Eris replied, his voice carrying the weight of old criticisms. "They said I got too involved with patients, that I absorbed their pain instead of simply treating their symptoms. And that's precisely what makes you exceptional," Virian said firmly. "Any fool can memorize healing spells and apply them mechanically. True healing requires empathy, connection, the willingness to share in suffering in order to transform it." The validation was like balm on wounds Eris hadn't even realized were still bleeding. For the first time since his rejection, someone was telling him that his sensitivity was a strength rather than a weakness. It was during his 3rd month at the estate that Eris encountered the child who would change everything. He was returning from the gardens where he'd been gathering herbs when he heard crying coming from one of the smaller outbuildings. Following the sound, he discovered a vampire child, perhaps the equivalent of 8 years old in human terms, huddled in a corner with obvious injuries. The boy was clearly terrified, his large dark eyes reflecting pain and confusion in equal measure. According to the other staff members, he was an orphan Virian had taken in after his parents were killed in territorial conflicts between vampire covens. The child had been traumatized by the experience and had been largely non-responsive since his arrival. "Hey there," Eris said gently, kneeling down to the child's level. "I'm Eris. I'm here to help with those hurts." The boy, Nikolai, his name was, flinched away from Eris's approach, clearly expecting more pain. But Eris didn't force contact. Instead, he simply sat nearby and began to project calm, soothing emotions through his empathic abilities. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he'd once used to comfort injured animals. "No one's going to hurt you here. You're safe." Took nearly an hour, but eventually Nikolai allowed Eris to approach. The healing process was delicate. The child's injuries were as much emotional as physical, requiring Eris to carefully absorb and transform layers of trauma and fear. When Virian found them later, Nikolai was sleeping peacefully in Eris's arms. His injuries healed and his face relaxed for the first time since his arrival. The vampire lord stood in the doorway for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "He hasn't let anyone touch him since he arrived," Virian said quietly, careful not to wake the sleeping child. "He just needed to know he was safe," Eris replied, gently stroking Nikolai's dark hair. "Children are more resilient than we think, but they need to feel protected before they can begin to heal." "Indeed," Virian murmured, but there was something in his tone that suggested deeper thoughts. "You have a gift that goes beyond mere healing magic." From that day forward, Nikolai became Eris's constant companion. The child followed him around the estate, slowly emerging from his shell under Eris's patient care. It was the first time since his rejection that Eris felt truly needed, truly valued for who he was rather than what he could provide. But more importantly, it was the first time he saw Virian's mask slip completely. Watching the ancient vampire lord reading bedtime stories to a traumatized child, seeing him carefully child-proof sections of the manor, witnessing his genuine concern for Nikolai's well-being, all of it revealed depths that Virian usually kept hidden. "You're not what I expected," Eris told him one evening as they watched Nikolai playing in the garden, his laughter bright and joyful for the first time in months. "What did you expect?" Virian asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "A monster," Eris admitted honestly. "The stories about vampires. They don't paint your kind in a favorable light. Some of those stories are true, Virian said matter-of-factly. I've done terrible things in my long existence, caused suffering that still haunts me. But I've learned that cruelty for its own sake is ultimately empty. There's no satisfaction in ruling through fear alone. And now I find myself more interested in building than destroying, in protecting rather than predating. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. In connections that matter, rather than power that ultimately means nothing. The admission hung between them, surprisingly vulnerable coming from such an ancient and powerful being. Eris felt his respect for Virian deepen, along with something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude or professional appreciation. As autumn turned to winter, their relationship continued to evolve. What had begun as master and servant gradually shifted into something more complex, teacher and student, perhaps, or even something approaching friendship. Their evening conversations became the highlight of Eris's day, intellectual exchanges that challenged him to think beyond the narrow confines of pack mentality. Virian, for his part, seemed genuinely interested in Eris's perspectives and experiences. He asked thoughtful questions about werewolf culture, about pack dynamics, about the healing traditions that Eris had learned. Their discussions often lasted until well past midnight, two beings from different worlds finding common ground in their shared exile from traditional society. It was during one such conversation that Virian revealed more about his own past. I was not born to nobility, he said, staring into the fireplace as snow fell softly outside the windows. I was turned during a time of great upheaval, when vampire society was even more rigid and hierarchical than it is now. For centuries, I fought for acceptance, for recognition, for a place in their elite circles. And did you find it? Eventually, Virian replied with a bitter smile. But by the time I achieved everything I thought I wanted, I realized how hollow it all was. Power without purpose, respect based on fear rather than admiration, relationships built on utility rather than affection. Is that why you're here? Away from vampire society. I'm here because I grew tired of playing games where the only prize was the right to play more games, Virian said. This estate, this household, it's real in a way that coven politics never were. The people here matter to me, not because of what they can do for me, but because of who they are. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. From that night forward, there was an undercurrent of deeper feeling in their interactions, an acknowledgement that what was growing between them transcended professional boundaries. But it was the arrival of unwelcome visitors that would force both of them to confront their feelings directly. Eris was in the garden with Nikolai when the alarms began ringing throughout the estate. The magical wards that protected Virian's territory were under attack, and the signature of the intruders was unmistakably werewolf. Through the empathic abilities that had grown stronger during his time at the estate, Eris could sense familiar emotional patterns, the aggressive certainty of pack wolves on a mission. They've found me, he said, his voice barely a whisper as he gathered Nikolai protectively in his arms. Virian appeared at his side within moments, his expression grim but determined. Get inside, he ordered. Take Nikolai to the safe room and stay there until this is over. No, Eris said firmly, surprising himself with his own resolve. If they're here for me, hiding won't solve anything. It will only put everyone else in danger. Through the estate's windows, they could see torches approaching through the forest. Dozens of werewolves surrounded the manor, their eyes glowing in the darkness like malevolent stars. At their head walked a figure Eris recognized with a mixture of dread and complicated emotions. Kale Ironclad, the alpha who had rejected him so cruelly months before. Virian Nightfall, Kale's voice carried across the courtyard, amplified by alpha authority and magical enhancement. We know you harbor a rogue Omega who poses a threat to pack stability. Return him to us, and we'll consider your interference in werewolf affairs forgiven. Interference? Virian's laugh was cold and dangerous as he stepped onto the manor's front steps, Eris beside him despite his attempts to get him to stay inside. I provided sanctuary to a being who was dying in the streets. If that constitutes interference in your primitive social order, Perhaps you need to reconsider your definitions. The Omega was cast out for good reason, Kale called back, his gaze fixed on Eris with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. He's unstable, dangerous. His very presence brings misfortune and death to those around him. Death. Virian's tone carried deadly amusement. The only death I see here is the spiritual death of a pack so rigid in its thinking that it would cast out one of its most gifted members for the crime of being sensitive. Eris felt a surge of gratitude for Virian's defense, but also a growing determination. This confrontation had been inevitable from the moment he'd begun to heal and grow stronger. He was tired of other people making decisions about his life without consulting him. I can speak for myself, he said, stepping forward to stand fully beside Virian. The action was symbolic, choosing his place, his loyalty, his future. Kale's expression twisted with something that might have been recognition mixed with disgust. Eris, you look different. It was true. Months of good food, intellectual stimulation, and genuine care had transformed Eris from the broken creature who had stumbled into exile. He stood straighter now, his eyes clear and determined rather than dulled by shame and despair. More importantly, he felt different. Stronger, more confident, certain of his own worth in ways he'd never been before. I am different, Eris confirmed, his voice carrying a strength that surprised even him. I'm no longer the frightened Omega you rejected. I'm no longer willing to accept other people's definitions of my worth. You think hiding behind a vampire makes you strong? Kale's tone was mocking, but Eris could sense the uncertainty beneath it through his enhanced empathic abilities. You're still the same weak creature I deemed unworthy of alpha consideration. Am I? Eris asked quietly. Or are you the same narrow-minded alpha who was too threatened by strength? He couldn't understand to recognize the gift he was throwing away. The question clearly caught Kale off guard. Through his abilities, Eris could sense the alpha's emotional turmoil. Anger and pride warring with something that might have been regret, overlaid with a desperate need to maintain face in front of his followers. You were cast out because you're a danger to pack stability, one of Kale's lieutenants called out. Your empathic abilities are uncontrolled, unstable. You could drive wolves to madness with your influence. Could I? Eris asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. In the months I've been here, have I driven anyone to madness? Have I used my abilities to harm or manipulate? Or have I used them to heal, to comfort, to bring peace to those who were suffering? The questions hung in the air unanswered, because the truth was obvious to everyone present. Eris had become stronger, more controlled, more confident in his abilities. The frightened, unstable Omega of Kale's description simply didn't exist anymore. Enough philosophical debate, Kale declared, his patience clearly exhausted. You will return with us, willingly or otherwise. The pack has declared you a threat that must be contained. He is under my protection, Virian said, power beginning to crackle around him like visible electricity. And I do not give up what is mine without a fight. What is yours? Kale's laugh was harsh and bitter. He's not your property, vampire. He's pack-born, pack-blood, and pack responsibility. You have no claim to him. I have the claim of choice, Virian replied firmly. His choice to stay, my choice to protect him. That's a concept your rigid hierarchy might not understand, but it's the foundation of everything meaningful in this world. Choice, Kale spat. What choice does a broken Omega have? What choice does he have but to accept whatever scraps of shelter he can find? The choice to define his own worth. Eris interjected, his voice growing stronger with each word. The choice to use his abilities as he sees fit. The choice to love and be loved for who he is, not who others expect him to be. The last word slipped out before Eris could stop it, and he felt Virian's surprise through their growing emotional connection. But it was true. What had developed between them over the months had grown beyond gratitude or partnership into something deeper and more precious. Love. Kale's expression twisted with something that might have been pain disguised as contempt. A vampire doesn't love, Eris. They collect, they use, they consume. You're nothing but a pretty toy he'll discard when he grows bored. That's where you're wrong, Virian said quietly, his voice carrying such conviction that even Kale's followers seemed to listen. I have lived for over 8 centuries, and in all that time, I have never encountered anyone who challenged me to grow, to change, to become better than what I was. He turned to look at Eris directly, his crimson eyes soft with an emotion that transformed his entire expression. Eris has brought light into an existence I hadn't realized had grown dark with loneliness. What we have isn't ownership or collection. It's choice. Every day we choose each other. Every day we choose to build something together rather than simply exist side by side. The declaration sent warmth flooding through Eris's chest. To hear his own feelings reflected back, to know that what he'd experienced wasn't one-sided or delusional, was like having a wound he hadn't known existed suddenly heal. I love you too, he said simply, not caring who heard or what they thought of it. How touching, Kale said coldly, but Eris could sense the fury and frustration in the Alpha's emotional signature. A vampire and his pet Omega, playing at romance. Changes nothing. You're coming with us. No, Eris said firmly. I'm not. The refusal seemed to break Kale's last restraint. Then we'll take you by force. You belong to the pack whether you accept it or not. Warriors advance. What followed was unlike any supernatural conflict in recorded history. Instead of meeting violence with violence, Eris did something unprecedented. He opened his empathic abilities fully, projecting not aggression or fear, but understanding and compassion. Every werewolf in the attacking force suddenly felt what Eris had experienced during his months at the estate. The gradual healing of rejection trauma, the joy of being valued for his true self, the deep contentment of finding purpose and love. They felt his genuine affection for Virian, his gratitude for sanctuary, his determination to choose his own path rather than having it chosen for him. Most importantly, they felt the depth of his compassion. Even for them, even for Kale, even for the people who had hurt him most deeply. The effect was immediate and profound. Several werewolves stopped mid-charge, overwhelmed by the emotional sharing. Others began to question why they were fighting someone who clearly bore them no ill will despite having every reason for hatred and revenge. What did you do? Kale demanded, his own emotional barriers strained by the psychic contact. I showed them the truth, Eris replied gently. I let them feel what rejection really costs, what abandonment really means. I let them understand that what we've built here isn't a threat to anyone. It's proof that there are other ways to live. Tricks and manipulation, Kale snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. Honesty and openness, Eris corrected. The exact opposite of manipulation. I'm not trying to control anyone. I'm trying to help them understand that strength comes in many forms, that leadership doesn't require domination, that love freely given is more powerful than loyalty extracted by force. The truth of his words seemed to resonate with more than just the attacking werewolves. Several of Kale's own pack members were looking uncertain, clearly reevaluating everything they thought they knew about strength, leadership, and loyalty. You're destroying everything, Kale said, but there was desperation in his voice now rather than anger. The traditions that have kept our people strong for generations, you're making them meaningless. I'm not destroying anything, Eris replied with infinite gentleness. I'm just showing that there might be other ways to be strong, other traditions worth building, other kinds of meaning that don't require anyone to sacrifice their happiness for someone else's vision of what their life should be. It was then that Nikolai appeared, having escaped from the safe room in his concern for Eris. The vampire child ran to Eris's side, clinging to his robes with obvious trust and affection. Papa Eris, Nikolai said in his sweet, high voice, using the name he'd started calling Eris weeks ago. Are the bad men going to take you away? The simple question, asked with a child's innocent directness, seemed to hit the assembled werewolves like a physical force. Here was living proof of Eris's character. A traumatized child who had healed under his care, who called him family, who trusted him completely. No, little one, Eris assured him gently, lifting Nikolai into his arms. No one is going to take me away. This is our home, and we're staying right here. Good, Nikolai said firmly. then looked at Kale with the fearless honesty that only children possessed. Papa Eris saved me when I was broken. He makes the hurting stop. Why do you want to hurt him? The question struck at the heart of Kale's justifications. How could he explain to a child that he was trying to drag away the person who had given him safety and love? How could he justify breaking up a family that was clearly built on genuine care and affection? The boy doesn't understand, Kale began, but Nikolai interrupted him with devastating simplicity. I understand that Papa Eris is good and kind and makes sad people feel better, the child said firmly. I understand that Father Virian protects us and keeps us safe. I understand that this is our family, and families stay together. The innocent wisdom of the child's words left the adult werewolves speechless. Here was everything they claimed to be fighting for: the protection of the innocent, the preservation of family bonds, the nurturing of the young, and it was judging their actions and finding them wanting. You see, Eris said softly, his voice carrying to every werewolf present. This is what we've built here. Not domination or manipulation, but love. Not control through fear, but guidance through example. Not hierarchy based on strength, but family based on choice. The confrontation was broken by the arrival of more of Virian's household staff, other outcasts and refugees who had found sanctuary at the estate. They formed a protective circle around Eris, Virian, and Nikolai, their faces showing determination rather than fear. We stand with our healer, one of them called out, a shapeshifter who had been cast out by his own pack for refusing to participate in territorial wars. He saved my life when no one else would even try. He gave my daughter hope when she thought she was worthless, added a human woman whose child had been born with unusual magical abilities that had terrified their community. One by one, members of Virian's household began to speak up, sharing stories of how Eris had touched their lives, had helped them heal from trauma, had shown them that they were worthy of love and acceptance despite being different. The testimonials created a powerful counter-narrative to Kale's accusations. Instead of an unstable Omega who brought danger and misfortune, they painted a picture of a gifted healer who had built a new kind of family based on mutual care and respect. This is what you're trying to destroy, Virian said quietly, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Not a threat to pack stability, but a demonstration that there are other ways to create community, other ways to build strength, other ways to love. Kale looked around at his followers, many of whom were clearly having second thoughts about their mission. The emotional sharing that Eris had initiated was still affecting them, making them question the rigid beliefs that had brought them here. Stand down, one of the younger wolves said suddenly, throwing down his weapon. I won't be part of breaking up a family. I won't be part of dragging away someone who's obviously happy and loved. Marcus, Kale's voice carried a warning, but other wolves were beginning to follow the young wolf's example.
No, Alpha, Marcus replied firmly.
This is wrong. We came here expecting to find a rogue threat, but what we found was a healer who's built something beautiful. Something we could learn from instead of destroying. The mutiny spread quickly through Kale's forces as more and more wolves began to question their alpha's leadership. Some simply laid down their weapons and walked away. Others openly challenged Kale's authority, demanding to know why they were threatening innocent people. You see what your influence does? Kale accused, turning back to Eris with fury in his eyes. You turn followers against their leaders, children against their parents, pack members against their alpha. This is why you were cast out. This is why you're dangerous. I don't turn anyone against anything, Eris replied with quiet dignity. I simply show them that they have choices, that they don't have to accept misery as the price of belonging, that there are places in the world where being different is valued rather than punished. And what happens when everyone makes the same choice you did? Kale demanded. When every Omega decides they don't need alpha protection. When every pack member decides they can just walk away whenever they disagree with leadership decisions. Then maybe, said a voice from among Kale's own remaining followers, we need to ask ourselves why so many of our people are unhappy enough to want to leave. The speaker was a beta wolf, one of Kale's own lieutenants, and his words carried the weight of uncomfortable truth. Around him, other pack members nodded, their expressions thoughtful rather than hostile. This is what your example does, Kale continued, but his voice was becoming more desperate than angry. It destabilizes everything, questions everything, undermines the very foundations of pack society. Maybe those foundations need to be questioned, Eris said gently. Maybe traditions should serve people, not the other way around. Maybe when systems consistently produce unhappiness and rejection and waste of potential, it's time to consider new approaches. The philosophical debate was interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the clearing. More figures were emerging from the forest, but these weren't werewolves. They were vampires, led by an elegant woman whose presence commanded immediate attention and respect. Lord Virian, she said, her voice carrying the authority of high position. I bring greetings from the Vampire Council and an offer of formal recognition for your autonomous territory. The arrival of vampire nobility changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Suddenly, what had been a simple matter of pack justice became a complex diplomatic situation involving multiple supernatural authorities. Lady Seraphina, Virian replied with a formal bow. To what do we owe this unexpected honor? Word has reached the council of the unique community you've established here, Lady Seraphina explained, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. The arrayed werewolves, the protective circle of household staff, Eris holding Nikolai in his arms. We're intrigued by reports of successful integration between species, of innovative approaches to traditional conflicts. She turned to address Kale directly, her tone cool but diplomatic.
Alpha Kael. ¿Y Believe?
We've heard of your territorial dispute with Lord Virian. Perhaps we can find a solution that satisfies all parties. This isn't a territorial dispute, Kale insisted, though he seemed intimidated by the vampire noble's presence. This is pack business. The Omega belongs to us by right of birth. Does he? Lady Seraphina asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity. And what right do you claim over a being who was formally exiled from your pack? What authority do you exercise over someone you yourself declared unworthy of membership? The question struck at the heart of Kale's legal position. By formally casting Eris out, the pack had relinquished any claim to him. He was no longer pack property because he was no longer pack at all. He carries our blood, Kale said desperately. He was born to our bloodlines, raised in our traditions. That can't simply be erased. Cannot it? Lady Seraphina's smile was sharp and knowing. I myself was born human, raised in human traditions, bound by human limitations. Yet here I stand, vampire nobility, owing no allegiance to my birth species. If transformation is possible for some, why not for all? The parallel was clear and devastating. If vampires could transcend their original nature, why couldn't werewolves? If Lady Seraphina could choose her own path despite her origins, why couldn't Eris? Furthermore, Lady Seraphina continued, the Vampire Council is prepared to offer Lord Virian's territory formal recognition as an autonomous zone, with all the diplomatic protections that entails. Any attack on his domain would be considered an act of war against the vampire nation. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Kale's pack might be able to challenge Virian individually, but they couldn't hope to stand against the combined might of vampire nobility. This is ridiculous, Kale protested, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. You're protecting a rogue Omega who could destabilize the entire supernatural order. Are we? Lady Seraphina asked, moving closer to examine Eris with obvious interest. From what I can see, this Omega has created remarkable stability. He's built a functioning community, healed traumatized children, inspired loyalty through compassion rather than fear. If that's destabilization, perhaps our current order needs destabilizing. She reached out to touch Nikolai gently, her expression softening as the child smiled at her with innocent trust. This little one seems remarkably well-adjusted for someone supposedly surrounded by dangerous instability. He is, Eris said softly, his pride in Nikolai evident in his voice. When he first came to us, he was broken by trauma, unable to trust anyone. Now look at him, happy, confident, surrounded by family who loves him unconditionally. Family, Lady Seraphina repeated thoughtfully. Not pack, not coven, but family. How refreshingly honest. She turned back to Kale, her expression becoming more serious. Alpha, I'm going to offer you a choice. You can continue this futile attempt to reclaim someone who clearly doesn't want to return to your pack, escalating this into a diplomatic incident that will bring unwanted attention from multiple supernatural authorities. Or you can accept that perhaps your loss is someone else's gain, that perhaps this Omega has found where he truly belongs. And if I choose to continue? Kale asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Then you'll find yourself facing not just Lord Virian, but the combined response of the Vampire Council, the Fae Courts who have also expressed interest in this territory, and likely several other supernatural authorities who see value in what's been built here. The threat was clear and comprehensive. What had begun as a simple pack matter had evolved into something much larger, a test case for new forms of supernatural community that had attracted attention from the highest levels of non-human society. Kale looked around at his remaining followers, most of whom were clearly having serious doubts about continuing the confrontation. The cost-benefit analysis was obvious. They could persist in trying to reclaim one supposedly troublesome Omega, or they could avoid a war they couldn't possibly win. This isn't over, Kale said finally, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Yes, it is, Eris replied gently. It was over the moment you rejected me and cast me out. It was over the moment I found people who value me for who I am rather than what they expect me to be. It was over the moment I learned that love freely given is stronger than loyalty extracted by force. He paused, looking directly at Kale with compassion rather than anger. I forgive you for rejecting me. I forgive you for the pain and trauma you caused. But I don't need your acceptance anymore, and I don't want your authority over my life. I've found something better. I've found home. The simple declaration seemed to take the last fight out of Kale. He looked around one more time, at his doubting followers, at the powerful vampire nobles, at the protective circle of Virian's household, at Eris holding Nikolai with obvious love and contentment. Come, he said to his remaining wolves. We're leaving. As the werewolf pack melted back into the forest, Lady Seraphina approached Virian and Eris with obvious satisfaction. That went rather well, I think. The council will be pleased to hear that our new autonomous zone is stable and secure. Thank you, Virian said formally. Your intervention was timely and appreciated. Think nothing of it, Lady Seraphina replied with a gracious smile. The council has been looking for innovative solutions to traditional conflicts for some time. What you've built here represents exactly the kind of progressive thinking we want to encourage. She turned to Eris, her expression becoming more personal. And you, young healer, have impressed us all. Your approach to conflict resolution, your ability to inspire loyalty through compassion rather than fear. These are skills the supernatural community desperately needs. I just want to help people heal, Eris said simply, to show them that they're worthy of love and acceptance, regardless of how others have treated them. Noble goals, Lady Seraphina agreed, and judging by the evidence, remarkably effective ones. After the vampires departed, the household slowly returned to its normal rhythms. The crisis had passed, but it had also marked a fundamental shift in their status. They were no longer simply refugees hiding from their past mistakes. They were a recognized autonomous community with formal diplomatic protection. That evening, as Eris was putting Nikolai to bed, the child asked a question that had been weighing on both their minds. Papa Eris, are the bad wolves going to come back? No, little one, Eris assured him, stroking his dark hair gently. They won't be back. This is our home and it's protected now. You're safe here always. Good, Nikolai said with the simple satisfaction of childhood. I like our family. I like how Father Virian reads to me and how you make the hurt go away and how everyone here is nice to each other. I like our family too, Eris agreed, feeling his heart full to overflowing with love and contentment. After Nikolai was asleep, Eris found Virian on the manor's balcony, looking out over their domain with an expression of quiet satisfaction. The vampire lord seemed lost in thought, his ancient features softened by moonlight and contentment. Any regrets? Virian asked as Eris joined him, the question echoing one they'd asked each other before. None, Eris replied firmly. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, with people who love me for who I am rather than who they want me to be. Even though it means giving up any chance of returning to traditional pack life? Especially because of that, Eris said with a laugh. I've seen what we can build when we're free to love without limits, to create family based on choice rather than obligation. Why would I want to go back to a world where my worth is determined by other people's narrow definitions? Virian turned to face him fully, his crimson eyes reflecting starlight and deep emotion. I love you, he said simply. Not because you're useful to me, not because you fulfill some role I needed filled, but because you've shown me what it means to live with purpose. You've taught me that strength isn't about domination, it's about lifting others up. I love you too, Eris replied, reaching out to take Virian's hands in his own. You saved my life, but more than that, you helped me discover who I really am. You gave me the space to heal, to grow, to become someone I could be proud of. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the lights of their community twinkle below them like earthbound stars. Each light represented someone who had found refuge in their domain. Outcasts and refugees who had discovered that family was indeed a choice, that love was indeed stronger than tradition, that home was indeed where you were valued for your true self. What do we do now? Virian asked eventually. Now we keep building, Eris said with quiet determination. We keep showing people that there are other ways to live, other ways to love, other ways to create community. We keep proving that the strongest bonds are those chosen freely rather than imposed by others. And if more challenges come, then we'll face them together, Eris replied. As we always have, as we always will. Together. As if summoned by their conversation, Nikolai appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes and looking for comfort after what was probably a nightmare. Papa Eris? Father Virian, I had a scary dream. Without hesitation, both men opened their arms to welcome the child between them. As they stood together, Vampire Lord, former Omega exile, and traumatized child who had healed into joy, they embodied everything their community represented. It's okay, Eris murmured, stroking Nikolai's hair. You're safe. We're all safe. This is our family, and families protect each other. Always, Virian added, his ancient voice warm with love and commitment, looking at his two most precious people, feeling the deep contentment that came from knowing he was exactly where he belonged. Eris reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The rejection that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something far more beautiful than he'd ever dared imagine. He had been born into a pack, but he had become himself only after finding love that transcended species, tradition, and expectation. What they had built together wasn't just a household or a community. It was proof that love, freely chosen and consciously nurtured, was indeed the strongest magic of all. In the distance, the lights of their domain continued to twinkle like promises of hope, each one representing a life transformed by the simple recognition that everyone deserved to be loved for who they truly were. And at the heart of it all stood three souls who had found each other against all odds, creating a family that would endure whatever challenges the future might bring. The healer's heart had indeed found its home, and that home would forever be wherever love was chosen over duty, understanding over judgment, and hope over despair. They had proved that the most beautiful families were those built not on blood or tradition, but on the conscious decision to care for each other unconditionally. And that was a legacy that would inspire others for generations to come. 5 years later, the morning sun painted golden streaks across the expanded grounds of what had once been simply Virian's estate, and had now grown into something unprecedented in supernatural history. The sanctuary, as it had come to be known throughout the various supernatural communities, housed over 300 beings from dozens of different species, all living together in relative harmony. Eris stood on the balcony of their private quarters, watching the daily bustle of their community with a sense of profound satisfaction. In the courtyard below, children of various supernatural heritages played together, vampire younglings racing alongside werewolf cubs, fey children teaching human orphans to make flowers bloom, and hybrid offspring who belonged to no single category but were valued precisely for their uniqueness. Still brooding over your success? Virian's voice came from behind him, warm with affection and gentle teasing. Not brooding, Eris replied, leaning back against his mate's solid chest as strong arms encircled his waist. Marveling. 5 years ago, I was a broken exile with nothing but the clothes on my back. Now look at all this. The transformation had been gradual but dramatic. Word of their successful integration community had spread throughout the supernatural world, drawing beings from every corner of the non-human realm. Rejected omegas, exiled vampires, displaced fae, hybrid children with nowhere else to turn. All had found their way to the sanctuary's gates. But more than just a refuge, they had created something revolutionary. A functioning society that proved different species could not only coexist but thrive together. Their healing centers combined the best medical knowledge from multiple traditions. Their schools taught integrated curricula that prepared children for a world where the old boundaries between species were becoming increasingly meaningless. Their workshops produced innovations that no single supernatural community could have achieved alone. Nikolai's been asking about the bonding ceremony again, Virian said, pressing a kiss to the top of Eris's head. He wants to know when you and I are going to make it official. Eris smiled at the mention of their adopted son. Now 13, Nikolai had grown into a confident young man who seemed to embody everything their community stood for. His vampire heritage gave him strength and longevity, but his upbringing in their nurturing environment had taught him to use those gifts for protection and healing rather than domination. What did you tell him? That we've been bonded in every way that matters since the night we first said we loved each other, Virian replied. But he pointed out that many of our residents come from traditions where formal ceremonies are important for community recognition. It was true. As their population had grown to include beings from various cultural backgrounds, they had developed new traditions that honored different heritage while creating inclusive practices that everyone could participate in. He's not wrong, Eris admitted. A formal bonding ceremony would send a powerful message about the permanence and legitimacy of our partnership, especially with the political challenges we've been facing lately. The challenges Eris referred to were growing pressure from traditional supernatural authorities who saw the sanctuary's success as a threat to established order. While they had formal recognition and diplomatic protection, there were factions within vampire, werewolf, and fae societies that viewed their integrated community as dangerous precedent that needed to be contained or eliminated. Lady Seraphina's latest reports suggest the resistance is getting more organized, Virian said, his tone becoming more serious. 3 separate supernatural councils have formed an alliance specifically to address what they're calling the integration problem. Let them form alliances, Eris said with quiet confidence. We'll continue doing what we've always done, proving that their fears are unfounded by living successfully according to our principles. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps and excited voices. Moments later, Nikolai burst through their private quarters, his face bright with enthusiasm. Father Papa, he said, using the names he'd settled on for his 2 parents. You need to come quickly. We have visitors, and they're asking to speak with the founders of the sanctuary. What kind of visitors? Virian asked, his protective instincts immediately alert. Good ones, I think, Nikolai replied, practically bouncing with excitement. There's a delegation from the Dragon Courts, and they're asking about establishing a similar community in the Eastern Mountains. Eris and Virian exchanged glances. The Dragon Courts were among the most ancient and powerful supernatural authorities, entities so old and mysterious that they rarely involve themselves in the affairs of younger species. For them to show interest in the sanctuary's model was unprecedented. They found the delegation waiting in the main hall, and Eris felt his breath catch at the sight of them. 3 beings of obvious draconic heritage stood with the calm dignity of immortal power, their human forms somehow managing to convey the massive strength and ancient wisdom of their true shapes. The leader, a tall woman with silver hair and eyes like molten gold, stepped forward with fluid grace. I am Counselor Thera of the Eastern Dragon Courts, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke of vast age and accumulated wisdom. We come seeking knowledge about your remarkable community. We're honored by your visit, Virian replied formally, though Eris could sense his curiosity through their bond. How may we assist the dragon courts? By sharing your experiences, Counselor Thera said simply. For millennia, our people have lived in isolation, believing that integration with other species would dilute our strength and corrupt our purpose. But recent events have forced us to reconsider these assumptions. She gestured toward one of her companions, a younger-looking dragon with kind eyes and gentle bearing. My colleague here is bonded to a being of mixed fae and human heritage, a relationship that would have been unthinkable under traditional dragon law. Yet their partnership has proven remarkably stable and productive. You're considering changing dragon isolation policies? Eris asked, intrigued by the implications. We're considering whether isolation serves our people or merely limits them, Counselor Thera replied. Your community represents the most successful example of large-scale supernatural integration we've encountered. We wish to understand how you've achieved such stability. What followed was a lengthy discussion about the principles and practices that had made the sanctuary successful. Eris found himself explaining their approach to conflict resolution, their educational philosophies, their methods for helping traumatized beings heal and integrate into community life. The key, he said as they toured the various facilities, is recognizing that strength comes from diversity rather than uniformity. When beings from different species work together, they bring different perspectives, different abilities, different solutions to common problems. But surely there are challenges, one of the other dragons observed. Conflicts arising from different instincts, different cultural practices, different biological needs. Of course there are challenges, Virian acknowledged. But we've found that most conflicts arise not from genuine incompatibility but from fear and misunderstanding. When people are given time to know each other as individuals rather than just representatives of their species, most barriers dissolve naturally. They paused at the community's healing center, where Eris had been developing new therapeutic techniques that combined supernatural abilities with traditional medicine. Through the windows, they could see him working with a young werewolf who had been severely traumatized by pack violence, using his empathic abilities to help the child process and release stored emotional pain. Remarkable, Counselor Thera murmured, watching the careful, patient work. In dragon society, trauma is typically handled through isolation and time. We assume that wounded individuals will eventually heal themselves through solitude. But this approach seems far more effective. Healing happens faster when it's supported by community, Eris explained. When individuals know they're not alone with their pain, that others understand and care about their recovery. The tour continued through the afternoon, with the dragon delegation asking thoughtful questions about everything from resource allocation to decision-making processes to methods for maintaining order without rigid hierarchy. We have no single leader, Virian explained as they discussed governance. Instead, we have councils that include representatives from different communities within the sanctuary. Major decisions are made collectively, with input from anyone who might be affected. And this doesn't lead to chaos or paralysis? Asked the third dragon, who had been largely silent until now. Occasionally it leads to lengthy discussions, Eris admitted with a smile. But it also means that when we do reach decisions, everyone feels invested in making them work. People follow rules they've helped create much more willingly than those imposed from above. As evening approached, the delegation gathered for dinner in the main hall alongside regular sanctuary residents. Eris watched with quiet satisfaction as the ancient, powerful dragons found themselves engaged in animated conversations with former outcasts and refugees who had become valued community members. You know, Counselor Thera said quietly to Eris as the meal wound down, when we first heard about your community, many in the dragon courts assumed it was a temporary experiment that would collapse once the novelty wore off. But seeing it firsthand, this isn't an experiment anymore. This is evolution. Evolution, Eris asked, curious about her perspective. The next stage in how supernatural beings relate to each other, she explained. For too long, our various species have operated under the assumption that separation was necessary for survival. You've proven that cooperation might actually be more effective. It's not without its challenges, Eris said honestly. There are still factions in every species that view integration as threatening. We face constant pressure to prove ourselves, to demonstrate that our way works better than traditional approaches. And yet you continue to grow, to thrive, to inspire others, Counselor Thera observed. The dragon courts aren't the only ones watching your progress. Reports suggest that similar communities are being established throughout the supernatural world, using your sanctuary as a model. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the main entrance. A group of travel-worn refugees had arrived, their emotional signatures immediately recognizable to Eris through his empathic abilities as beings in desperate need of sanctuary. Without thinking, Eris excused himself and went to greet the newcomers. The group consisted of a dozen individuals, werewolves, vampires, and what appeared to be hybrid children, all showing signs of recent trauma and exhaustion. "Welcome," Eris said gently, projecting calm and safety through his abilities. "You're safe now. We'll get you food, medical attention, and places to rest while you tell us what you need." The apparent leader of the group, a middle-aged werewolf with scars across his face and arms, looked at Eris with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Are you really the healer? The one they call the Omega Father?" The title made Eris slightly uncomfortable. It had emerged organically among refugee communities who shared stories of the sanctuary. But he nodded.
I'm Eris.
"This is our community, and you're welcome here as long as you choose to stay. Our packs were destroyed," the werewolf explained, his voice rough with exhaustion and grief. "Territorial wars, political purges, ideological conflicts. The traditional supernatural world is tearing itself apart. We heard that there was a place where beings like us could find peace." "You heard correctly," Eris assured him. "Come, let's get you settled, and tomorrow we can discuss your options and what kind of life you'd like to build here." As the sanctuary staff moved efficiently to care for the new arrivals, Counselor Thera approached Eris with obvious admiration. "That's the third group of refugees you've received this week, isn't it?" "Actually the fifth," Eris corrected. "But yes, we're seeing increasing numbers of beings fleeing traditional supernatural societies. The old ways are becoming less sustainable as supernatural populations grow and interact more frequently with the human world." "And you simply accept them all?" "We evaluate each individual case," Virian interjected, joining the conversation. "Some beings arrive here because they genuinely want to be part of an integrated community. Others are simply running from consequences of their own actions. We've learned to distinguish between refugees seeking new opportunities and troublemakers seeking to avoid accountability. But in principle, yes," Eris added. "We believe everyone deserves a chance to choose the life they want, regardless of their origins or past mistakes." That evening, after the dragon delegation had retired to their guest quarters, Eris and Virian found themselves alone on their balcony once again, processing the day's events. "They're really going to do it," Virian mused. "The dragons are going to establish their own integrated community." "It seems that way," Eris agreed. "And if the dragon courts embrace integration, it will legitimize the concept for other traditional supernatural authorities who have been hesitating." "Are you ready for that level of influence?" Virian asked seriously. "Being seen as the founders of a movement that reshapes supernatural society?" Eris considered the question carefully. 5 years ago, he had been focused simply on surviving his rejection and exile. Now he found himself at the center of changes that could affect every supernatural being in existence. "I think about that scared, broken Omega who stumbled into your territory," he said finally. "He never could have imagined any of this. But that same Omega had something inside him that was worth saving, worth nurturing, worth believing in. And now I think about all the other scared, broken individuals out there who just need someone to show them that they're worthy of love and respect. If our example can help them find that, then yes, I'm ready for whatever influence comes with it." Virian pulled him closer, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the lights of their community twinkle below like earthbound stars. "There's something else we should discuss," Virian said eventually. "Lady Seraphina sent word that there's going to be a gathering of progressive supernatural leaders next month. They want to establish formal alliances between communities that support integration. A supernatural United Nations," Eris mused. "Interesting concept." They've specifically requested that we host the gathering, Virian continued. As the most successful example of large-scale integration, they want to hold it here at the sanctuary. Eris felt a thrill of both excitement and nervousness at the prospect. Such a gathering would bring together the most influential progressive voices from every major supernatural species. The decisions made could reshape the entire non-human world. What did you tell them? That I'd discuss it with my partner and co-founder, Virian replied with a smile. This community belongs to both of us, after all. The formal recognition of their equal partnership in the sanctuary's leadership was something that had evolved naturally over the years. While Virian had provided the initial resources and protection, Eris had become the heart and soul of their community, the one who set the tone and established the principles that made integration possible. I think we should do it, Eris said after a moment's consideration. If we're going to advocate for our way of life, we should be willing to open our doors and show others exactly how it works. Even knowing it will attract attention from conservative factions who oppose integration? Especially knowing that, Eris replied firmly. We've spent 5 years proving that our approach works in isolation. Now it's time to prove it can work under scrutiny. Their planning was interrupted by Nikolai's arrival, though their adopted son moved more quietly now than he had as a child. Am I interrupting? He asked politely. Never, Eris assured him, opening his arms for the embrace that had become their evening ritual. How did your studies go today? Nikolai was currently pursuing an advanced curriculum that combined vampire magical theory, werewolf pack dynamics, Fey diplomatic protocols, and human technology, preparing him for a future where such cross-species knowledge would be increasingly valuable. Professor Ashworth thinks I'm ready to start practicing mediation between different species groups, Nikolai reported proudly. There's a minor dispute between the vampire residents and some of the newer werewolf refugees about hunting territory boundaries. And you want to try resolving it? Virian asked, pride evident in his voice. With supervision, Nikolai said quickly. I'm not overconfident enough to think I can handle complex territorial negotiations on my own yet. The maturity and wisdom in his response was testament to the balanced upbringing he'd received. Growing up in an environment where cooperation was valued over dominance had shaped him into someone who sought understanding rather than victory. I think that's an excellent idea, Eris said. Practical experience is the best teacher, and territorial disputes are actually good training cases because the underlying interests are usually straightforward. Will you observe? Nikolai asked hopefully. I'd like your feedback on my technique. Of course, Eris agreed. In fact, why don't we make it a family project? Your father can provide perspective on vampire concerns, I can help with emotional dynamics, and you can practice synthesizing different viewpoints into workable solutions. The suggestion delighted Nikolai, who had always thrived on collaborative learning. As they discussed potential approaches to the territorial dispute, Eris reflected on how naturally their unconventional family had developed its own traditions and rhythms. Later, after Nikolai had gone to bed, Eris and Virian returned to their private quarters to continue their earlier conversation about the proposed gathering. If we're going to host such an important meeting, Virian said as they prepared for bed, we should probably formalize our own partnership first. Show the attending leaders that integration can work at the most personal level. Are you proposing to me? Eris asked with amusement. I suppose I am, Virian replied, suddenly looking almost nervous despite their years together. We've built a life, a family, a community together. It seems appropriate to make our commitment official before asking others to follow our example. Eris felt warmth flood through his chest at the formal acknowledgement of what they'd known for years. Yes, he said simply. Yes, I want that. I want the world to know that what we have is real, permanent, and worth celebrating. The bonding ceremony they planned was unlike anything in supernatural tradition, because there was no tradition for what they were doing. Instead, they created something new, a ritual that honored both their individual heritages while celebrating the unique bond they had forged. The ceremony took place on the spring equinox, with the entire sanctuary community in attendance. Representatives from friendly supernatural authorities also came to witness the historic event, including Lady Seraphina, Counselor Thera, and surprisingly, even some progressive werewolf leaders who had broken away from traditionalist packs. Today we witness something unprecedented, Lady Seraphina said as she served as one of the officiants. Not just the bonding of two individuals, but the celebration of a partnership that has transformed how supernatural beings think about love, family, and community. Eris and Virian stood together in the community's central garden, surrounded by flowering trees that seemed to pulse with magical energy. Nikolai served as their witness and ring-bearer, his face glowing with pride and happiness. "I choose you," Eris said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "Not because fate decreed it, not because tradition demanded it, but because you saw worth in me when I couldn't see it in myself, because you gave me space to heal and grow, because you helped me discover that the greatest strength comes from lifting others up." "I choose you," Virian replied, his ancient eyes bright with emotion. "Because you taught me that love isn't about possession or control, it's about growing together. Because you showed me that immortality means nothing without someone to share it with. Because you proved that the heart can indeed grow stronger with age if it's nourished by genuine affection." They exchanged rings forged from metals that symbolized their journey. Silver from Eris's werewolf heritage and obsidian from Virian's vampire nature, blended together into something entirely new and uniquely beautiful. "By the power of choice freely made and love consciously nurtured," Nikolai said formally, "I declare you bonded in all ways that matter now and always." The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and storytelling that reflected the cultural diversity of their community. But for Eris, the most meaningful moment came when former refugees approached them with gifts and testimonials about how the sanctuary had changed their lives. "You saved us all," one young hybrid said, tears streaming down his face. "Not just by giving us shelter, but by showing us that we were worthy of love exactly as we were." "You saved yourselves," Eris replied gently. "We just provided a safe space for you to remember your own worth." As the festivities wound down and their community gradually settled into peaceful sleep, Eris and Virian found themselves once again on their balcony, but this time as officially bonded partners. "Any regrets?" Virian asked, echoing a question that had become something of a tradition between them. "Only that it took us so long to make it official," Eris replied with a smile. "And you? Only that I waited 8 centuries to learn what love really meant," Virian said, pulling Eris closer. "But perhaps that was necessary. Perhaps I needed to become who I was before I could appreciate who you are." In the distance, the lights of their domain continued to shine like beacons of hope, each one representing a life that had been transformed by the simple recognition that everyone deserved to be loved for their true self. And at the heart of it all stood 2 souls who had found each other against all odds, proving that the most beautiful bonds were those built not on obligation or tradition, but on the conscious decision to choose love every day. The healer's heart had indeed found its home, and that home would continue to grow and inspire others for generations to come. Their love story had become a legend, but more importantly, it had become a roadmap for others seeking to build lives based on acceptance, understanding, and the radical belief that differences were strengths rather than weaknesses. As they stood together under the starlit sky, surrounded by the evidence of the love they had built and shared, Eris knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them as they always had, together, with courage, compassion, and an unshakable faith in the power of chosen family to transform the world.